Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to take another look at our fundamentals demo, and specifically, we are going to take a look at our registrant class. Now, in earlier videos, we've taken a look at our constructor and done some basic validation or error checking inside of the constructor, and we've also done some basic validation inside of our setters, particularly those for the active first name and last name. However, as we saw in an earlier video, if we call our constructor with a single argument and then later on add the first name and last name using the setters, we do not do anything with the status. Now, as a quick reminder, the status field is supposed to help us understand the status of the object. In other words, whether it is of an unknown status, complete or incomplete, it tells us whether or not the registrant has all of the information it's supposed to. And again, there's a couple of different ways that we can go about doing this, but fundamentally what we don't want to do is to have that responsibility for checking whether or not the registrant is complete in each of our setters. In other words, what we could do is inside our set first name, we could check to see what the other fields were, and if all the other fields were appropriately completed, then the status of the object would be complete. Well, that's fine if you only have a couple of fields. For instance, we have our first name and our last name, but you'd end up having duplicate code in multiple locations, as well as if you were to add another field that needs to be validated, you would have multiple places in your code that you would have to make changes. Again, not a great idea. So what we can do instead is we can create another method whose sole responsibility is to check to see that all of the fields are in fact valid. And so what we can do is take a quick refresher of what our fields are that we wish to validate. We set our username, first name, last name. Arguably, we could check the active as well to check that it has a default value, and the status enum itself. But we're going to keep this example simple. We're going to focus on the username, the first name, and the last name. And so to accomplish this, what I want to do is I want to create one more function. We are going to make it public. We're going to make the return value be of type EE333.status. And we are simply going to call it a validate. In other words, it's going to validate our object. And the idea is then it will set the status accordingly. And first thing that we want to do now here is we want to go ahead and create a local variable of type EE333.status. We're going to call this one results. And we are going to be optimistic in we are going to set it to status.complete. So we're going to assume that our object is valid. And then we are simply going to return results. Now, inside of this method, we are going to go through each of the fields that are critical to our object. Now, we're going to assume that there is no way that the username can be passed to our constructors without throwing an exception if it is invalid. So we're not going to have this particular method throw an exception, although you could technically consider that. Instead, what we're going to do is we're just going to check each one of the fields to make sure they are in fact not null and that they are of appropriate length, and then later on perhaps consider including regular expressions or some additional parsing to look at numerical values and other characters. But to begin with, what we want to do is we simply have an if statement. And again, we're going to keep this one very similar to our constructor and to the logic that we've seen in our setters. And we'll check to see if the username is equal to null or the username dot length is equal to 0. And if either of these are true, we simply set the results equal to EE333.status.incomplete. At this point, then we can simply go through our other fields by doing an else if, again, checking both to see that our first name is equal to null, or our username, or rather, excuse me, our first name dot length is equal to 0. And if either of these are true, again, we simply say results are equal to EE333 dot status dot incomplete. And then lastly, we can do the same thing now with our last name. As a matter of fact, I'm going to just do a little bit of creative copying and pasting. And again, complete. And then under the else branch, if it has survived all of our tests, we can simply say results are going to be equal to EE333.status.complete. And at this point, then what we would do is outside of our validation if-else if structure, we now set this dot status equal to whatever the results are. Now, at this point, you could probably see some opportunities for improvement. The first of which is we technically did not need to have the results local variable. If anything, that's just for convenience as far as our logic, and hopefully it makes it a little bit clearer. But then what we want to do is reconsider our enum status. For instance, in the beginning, we naively assumed that our object is valid, but technically speaking, at the beginning of this validate process, you didn't. As a matter of fact, you had an unknown status. By virtue of using this else in our if-else if structure, we can now handle all three scenarios where it is unknown, incomplete, and complete. And so therefore, the default status should probably be unknown at the beginning of our method. In this way, if something were to happen, in other words, if you've forgotten or it did not handle your if-else if correctly, then you would simply be setting the status of the object to unknown to reflect the fact that not all of your tests have been covered. At this point, then we can simply return whatever the results are, or we can also consider just replacing this with return this dot status. Either would work. And then in our fundamentals demo, what we want to do is we want to make a call to our object using our newly created validate function to demonstrate that we can, in fact, validate our first name and last name. So there is our registrant_1.validate. But then the question begs, whose responsibility is it to validate this object? In other words, is this the correct place to do this? In other words, should it be the calling function's responsibility to validate your object? And the answer is probably not. In other words, that's probably an internal process that you can potentially call if you wanted to verify whether or not an object is in fact valid. So we've got a couple of things to consider here. Number one is, what does this get us? Well, it tells us whether the object is valid by virtue of the return value, but the other thing that it does is it runs this process that changes the status. In which case, what we can do is we can simply leverage this validate function inside of our setters. And to begin with, what we want to do is we want to focus on our set first name. And we simply go ahead and run this inside of our setter to go ahead and validate our object after we have set the first name. Likewise, we can go ahead and do this inside of our set last name, and this will keep our object updated on the status based on whatever changes have been made in the individual fields. Again, this depends on the purpose of your object and how it fits in the system, is whether you need to do this in all of your setters, and for that matter, in which setters you need to do this in. But we'll go ahead and build this. And to demonstrate how this is going to work, I'm actually going to go ahead and take this one out, and I'm going to inject another system.out.println in between our set first name and set last name, as well as another break in our table after each one of the two strings, so that you can see how this works. Let me move this down here real quick. And then to reduce the noise that we've got in this particular example, I'm going to temporarily comment out my other two try-catch blocks, just so that we don't have as much noise on our console. We'll rerun our registrant demo, and you'll notice that we start off with a registrant with just G. Myers populated, then G. Myers with the first name populated, but still a status of incomplete. And then finally, once we have added the last name, the status then becomes complete. Now, what I encourage you to do is go through and attempt to set the last name to an empty string and see if that changes the status, or if you have successfully handled that in your setter. Likewise, with the first name, see if you can actually change the first name to an empty string without the object changing its status. Hopefully you found this video useful. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, email me, and thank you for watching.